Today I want to look at the second covenant that God made with his ancient people of Israel. This was the covenant which we call the priestly covenant, the covenant which established the pattern of worship which was to govern the nation until the coming of Christ. God made a prophetic covenant with Abraham, promising that he would fulfill certain things, that he would give Abraham a country, that he would give Abraham a great nation, and so on. And over time, we see how this developed in the family, first of all of his son Isaac, but then more especially of his grandson Jacob. But we learn from the book of Genesis that there were problems in Jacob's family. Jacob had 12 sons. He had 2 wives and 2 concubines. So there were 4 women who were the mothers of his sons. But Jacob had a favorite. He had a favorite wife, Rachel. And Rachel was the mother of 2 of his sons, one of them Joseph and the other Benjamin. And of course it was in the birth of Benjamin, the younger one, that Rachel failed to survive. She didn't live past the birth of Benjamin. She died and was buried at that time. But she always remained the favorite wife of Jacob. And so Joseph, as the older of the sons, was Jacob's favorite. We all know, of course, that this is a source of problems. If you have a large family and it's clear that one of your children is your favorite, you are sowing trouble for the future because the other children don't like this. The other children feel jealous about this. And particularly if the other children are older, as they were in this case, the result was not a happy one. And we know that at one stage the other brothers were out in the fields looking after their animals, and Joseph went to join them. But Jacob the father had made a special coat, a coat of many colors, to give to Joseph as a sign that Joseph was the favorite. And of course the other brothers didn't like this at all. And they conspired against Joseph. They said, we have to get rid of Joseph because we cannot live like this. I mean, if Joseph is going to be, our father's favorite, and we end up being subjected to him, that Joseph will rule over us. This is wrong. It's unfair. We can't allow this. So they beat Joseph up. They said, we're not tolerating this. And when a caravan came by that was going down to Egypt, they sold him into slavery. So Joseph was sold as a slave in Egypt. And then the brothers pretended to their father that he had been killed by a wild animal, because they took the coat back and covered with blood, and just said, well, that's it. Sorry, Joseph is gone. You've lost your favorite son. Well, of course, this was a bad thing to do. We might say it wasn't very wise of Jacob to make Joseph his favorite in that way, but it was still wrong for the brothers to react in the way that they did. You don't kill somebody because of jealousy in this, or if you do, you are committing a sin, of course, which will one day come back to haunt you. And that is indeed what happened in the case of the sons of Jacob. It turned out, and this is one of the great ironies, if you like, of life, that by selling Joseph into slavery in Egypt, the brothers, his brothers, were actually preparing a blessing for themselves in the future. This, of course, was not their intention. They had no idea that that was going to happen. And poor old Joseph himself didn't realize it either. But Joseph was an extraordinary man. It wasn't just that he was his father's favorite. He was also very gifted in other ways. He was a very wise person. And he had the gift of dreams. Now, this is something that we meet with in the Old Testament from time to time, that great prophets, great men had dreams, and in their dreams they would see things and be given a knowledge and an understanding of life that was not given to ordinary people. And Joseph was like this. Joseph had dreams, and he was able to tell the future. And he did. He told the future to various people. And eventually, of course, as we know when we read the stories, this came to the attention of the king, the Pharaoh of Egypt. And Joseph prophesied. He said he had a dream that there would be 7 years of prosperity, 7 years of growth and wealth, followed by 7 years of famine. And that if the king wanted to be wise in the way he ruled the people, he would store up store up crops, wheat and so on, during the 7 years of prosperity, so that when the famine came, there would be resources to feed the people. It was a very wise thing to do. And because the king accepted this, he understood this, he made Joseph ruler of his kingdom. So Joseph went from being a slave one minute to being, in effect, the prime minister of Egypt the next minute. Somebody who was in charge of the whole nation. Now we know, of course, that when the famine years came, the Jacob and his family were suffering, because the famine was not just in Egypt, it was also in Canaan, which is the next door country, the neighboring country, what is now Israel. And in desperation, they went to Egypt. The brothers went to Egypt in order to get food so that they could take back and that they could survive. And we know, of course, that what happened, that they eventually found out that the ruler of Egypt was their brother Joseph, much to everybody's surprise. And when this was revealed, Joseph invited them and their father Jacob to come to Egypt, to live in Egypt. And so the children of Abraham, the nation of Israel, went to Egypt and lived there for 400 years. 400 years, which is a very long time. And during that time, although they retained their identity, they didn't integrate, they didn't become Egyptians during that time. They remained a separate nation. But as time went on, the reason why they were there was forgotten. You see, people forgot about Joseph. They didn't know anything about this. And they gradually began to wonder, well, what are these people doing here? And of course, the kings of Egypt saw that there was this alien group, this basically foreign group, which was in Egypt and which was growing. It was getting bigger and bigger, and they saw it as a threat to their own rule, to their own society. And so they decided that they had to do something about this. And they came up with what we would today call genocide. Now, they didn't go around killing every Israelite person they could find. I mean, it wasn't as crude as that. But they tried to limit births. You see, they said, well, we won't kill everybody, but we will kill the boys who are born to these people. You see, we will seize them and kill them, so that the next generation, the girls, would have to marry into Egyptian families, and they would integrate into Egypt. They would become Egyptians. Well, this policy was never likely to work very well, and of course we know that it didn't, because in the case, in at least one case that we know about, the mother who produced a baby boy, rather than allow him to be killed by the Egyptians, she put him in a little boat and hid him among the reeds by the river Nile. And it was there that the daughter of the king happened to see this, realized what was going on, that this was a child of the Hebrews, of the Israelites, and adopted him, took him into her family, brought him up as an Egyptian. But of course, although he was brought up as an Egyptian, the daughter of Pharaoh realized that he was from a Hebrew background, an Israelite background, and so she got wet nurses, she got maids, she got people from that community to look after the young boy. So that although the young boy was brought up in the house of the king, he was also educated in the ways of his own people, because this was the way that the daughter of Pharaoh thought was best for bringing him up. So Moses, as we call him, as he was called, was a child, a Hebrew child, but he lived in two worlds. He lived in the Egyptian world and also in the world of his own people, of Israel. When he became an adult, he was forced to choose, because an accident happened. He accidentally killed a man, and that, of course, was a crime. And he had to flee. He had to leave Egypt. He went into the desert, not very far away, but nevertheless a different kind of life, a different kind of world. And he was accepted there. He was taken in, and he married into the family of this desert people, and lived there. But it was when he was in the desert that God met with him. Now, we don't know what kind of experience of God Moses might have had before this happened. There's no sign that he was brought up, to believe in God or to worship God the way the Israelites did. Perhaps he was brought up that way. We don't know. But there's nothing said about this. However, when he was in exile, when he was a grown man, God appeared to him in a bush which was on fire. The bush was on fire, but it wasn't burnt. It wasn't burnt up. It was just there. And Moses realized that this was something very unusual, and he went to the near, but he heard the voice of God telling him to take your shoes off, because you're on holy ground. I am the God of your fathers. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. But more importantly, I am who I am. And you must go and tell the people, your people of Israel, that I am has sent you to them, because I am going to deliver them from Egypt. I'm going to take them out of Egypt and bring them to the land which I promised to Abraham. Bring them back to the place where they should be, where they can develop and grow into the nation, the great nation, which I promised Abraham they would become. Now Moses, of course, didn't know how to react to this. Moses was not happy to be told by God that this is what he was going to do. And Moses said to God, well, really, I'm not the right person for this. You chose me, okay, but I need help. I need somebody to go with me. And so God said, well, your brother here, Moses had an older brother who must have been born before the decree to kill the children was enacted. Your brother, Aaron, will go with you, and he will speak for you. He'll be the spokesman. You see, you're the one whom I'm spoken to. You're the one that I've given the covenant to. But Aaron will be the one to stand in front of Pharaoh and speak on your behalf. So Moses agreed to this, and of course they went to Pharaoh and said to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." And of course Pharaoh refused, and the result was that Egypt suffered a plague because as punishment for not letting the Israelites leave. And we know from the stories that this went on. There were several plagues like this because Pharaoh kept refusing to let the people go. But eventually there came a point where things got very bad, and Moses and Aaron said to the king, the firstborn child of every family in Egypt will be killed because you have not let my people go. And when that happened, the Egyptians finally gave way. They said, all right, this is too dangerous. This is too much problem. You go, you leave. And so they did. Well, they got into the desert, of course, and they went to the mountain, Mount Sinai, which is in the desert, not very far from Egypt. In fact, nowadays it's actually part of Egypt. It belongs to Egypt, although you can go and visit it still. But it was there, after they escaped, that God told Moses to go up to the top of the mountain, and it was while he was at the top of the mountain that he gave to him the 10 Commandments, the commandments which would become the kind of constitution, the moral constitution for the people of Israel. Meanwhile, though, the rest of the people who were waiting for Moses, they didn't know why Moses had gone up the mountain. They didn't know why Moses was staying there for so long. And they said to Aaron, Moses' brother, Moses has disappeared. He's not coming back. We need you to provide for us a form of worship. And so they said, make a calf, make a golden calf, set up this idol, and we shall worship this idol. And Aaron, who didn't know what to do, did as they said. He actually established this and set up this religion for Israel to follow. Well, of course, we know that Moses came down from the mountain at this point, saw what was going on, and was so angry that he destroyed the tablets that he'd received from God, the 10 Commandments, and said, "This is terrible. You can't live like this. This is a complete denial of everything that God wants us to do." And so there had to be a new beginning. You see, Moses was told to start over again. He went back up the mountain, got the tablets again, came down a second time. But equally importantly, he told Aaron, this is not the way that you are to worship God. And he established a system, a pattern of worship, which we have in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers in the Old Testament. That it's all laid out there. who the priest should be, what the priest should do, the sacrifices that they were to make. The whole system of worship was set up for the people of Israel. Now, the key to this was sacrifice. That at the heart of Israelite worship was the whole question of making peace with God. God is angry with us because of our sin. We know this already, of course, that we are sinners and that God cannot accept this. So somehow we have to get into the right relationship with Him. How are we going to do this? Well, Moses said, there are certain things that you must do, that you must, of course, worship God. The first 4 of the 10 Commandments, you must worship God, and then you must love your neighbor as yourself. Put those two things together. But that was the key, that was the basis. But there were many other things, that every aspect of your life must be dedicated to the service of God. The way you work, the way you rest, that on the seventh day you must rest before you and consecrate that day to the worship of God. What you eat is important. You must eat certain things and not other things. The food laws that we find in the Old Testament were developed at this time. There was a whole system of what we would today call criminal law. If you kill somebody else's horse, you pay a certain amount. If you kill their donkey, you pay a certain amount. If you kill a member of their family, of course, you have to pay for that as well. And so it goes. You see, there's a whole series of criminal punishments which are there and which are to be applied. And of course, it was the priesthood that would control this in a way. That if people had to make sacrifice for the sins that they had committed, if they had to make reparations, who would they go to? How would they do this? Well, they took it to the priests. So there was a certain sacrifice that you made for one thing, and another sacrifice that you made for something else. It was all sort of laid out in order and in a system which would then be applied across the board to the nation as a whole. Everybody was subject to this. The heart of it, though, was the great sacrifice which would be made once a year on what is called the Day of Atonement, the day of reconciliation between God and the people. And on that day, the chief priest, the high priest, in other words, Aaron himself and his descendants, would go into the sacred place, the heart of the tabernacle as it was in the desert, and later on in the temple as it would become in Jerusalem. And there he would kill a pure lamb as a sacrifice for the sins of the whole people. And only the high priest could do this, and only once a year. And that would be the atonement. That would be the sacrifice made for the sins of the people for that year. And that was to be the sign of God's presence, of God's forgiveness to them, that as they made atonement in this way, so their sins would be forgiven. And this became the central act of worship in the life of Israel, the Israelite people. And even today, although there is no more temple and there are no priests, the Day of Atonement, this day which is set aside, is still the most solemn and holy day in the Jewish calendar. And they celebrate it even now when there is no actual sacrifice. That's how important it is in their concept of their relationship with God. And of course, Jesus, when he came, took this over, that Jesus was the lamb, the pure lamb, who would be the sacrifice. He was also the high priest, the priest who would make the sacrifice and die for the sins of the people. And this is central, of course, to his ministry. This is what he came to do, to be that atonement, that sacrifice, which, because it was done by him, and not by a priest sacrificing an animal once a year, it is something that cannot be repeated, that does not have to be repeated. It's not something that has to be done every year, but it was something that was done once for all time. And this atonement, you see, the idea of atonement was given to Moses as a priestly covenant. And this is the importance of it, that this was the way in which God would eventually save his people, that he was showing the pattern, showing how it would develop. Now, the priesthood in Israel was something that was inherited from one generation to the next. There was a whole tribe, the tribe of Levi, which was the tribe of the priests. And this tribe was not like the others. The other tribes were given land. They formed part of the armies of Israel and so on. They lived like normal people, you might say. But the Levites had no land. They were not in the army. They were the priests. And the other tribes supported them by making offerings. You see, the sacrifices and so on were then eaten. If they sacrificed an animal, that sacrifice would then be eaten by the Levites. That's how they lived, how they survived. But of course, as always, when this kind of system is established, not everybody who was a member of the tribe of Levi was equally committed to the mission, to the task which was given to them. And there was a lot of corruption. And we read later on of how some of the priests abused their positions and so on, and tried to exploit people, to take advantage of the privileges that were given to them. And that this was a very serious problem in Israel for quite a long time. So there was this wasn't the answer, this wasn't the solution. And we find that even in the time of Jesus, the priests were not necessarily fully dedicated to the service of God. Some were, of course. I mean, there were some good ones. But there were others who just did not have the Spirit of God in them. And so they were corrupting the worship of God, and by corrupting the worship of God, they were corrupting the people of God. These two things went together, and Israel suffered as a result. So that when Jesus came, of course, the priestly covenant, the covenant made with Moses, had served its purpose, and it was time to come to an end. And after Jesus died and rose again from the dead, we know that the temple and the priesthood, the temple was destroyed by the Romans, the priesthood ceased to exist, and that aspect of the covenant no longer applies in Israel, but it is fulfilled in Christ, that Jesus Christ is our great high priest. He is also our sacrifice, and it is in that way that the law given to Moses is fulfilled in the Christian church, in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Today I want to look at the third covenant that God made with his ancient people of Israel, and that is the covenant made with David, the covenant that we call the kingly covenant. We had the prophetic covenant with Abraham, the priestly covenant with Moses, and now the kingly covenant with David. And this represents the third of the great offices in the state of Israel, the prophet, the priest, and the king. And we find that Jesus is the one who is all three. Jesus is the prophet who brings to fulfillment the prophecies of old. He is the priest who sacrifices himself for the sins of the people. And of course he is the king who rules over the nation as the spiritual head. The kingly covenant made with David is particularly important because when Jesus came into the world, when the Son of God came and was born in Bethlehem, which was the city of David, or the place where David was born, this was how he was identified. During his earthly ministry, people called him the Son of David. And I think the main reason for that, of course, is that David was the great king of Israel, the one who had consolidated the nation in that way. And they thought that Jesus, as the son of David, the descendant of David, that he would do the same thing, that he would reestablish the kingdom of David, which of course he didn't do, at least not in the way that they imagined he would. And yet, the fact that he was the son of David, this was understood, this was noted, and this is important for our understanding of Jesus and his ministry. But to understand where this covenant comes from and why it was introduced into Israel, we have to go back to Moses. Moses gave the law to the nation. Moses established leadership in the nation. Aaron, his brother, died in the desert, but after that Moses seems to have taken over and he ruled. Whatever reluctance he had as a younger person to do this seems to have faded in later life. And although Moses is known to have had a fiery temper, and he was very upset with the people of Israel from time to time, and sometimes did things that he probably shouldn't have done. In particular, at one point, when God told him to strike a rock and that water would come out, he went too far and he struck it too hard, and basically in anger, and God rebuked him for that, and said, because of this, you see, because Moses had shown himself to be inadequate as a leader in some way, that Moses would not go into the promised land, that Moses would not live to see the fulfillment of his own ministry, that he would die in the desert, and that he would be succeeded by one of the warriors, a man called Joshua, who would be the one who would lead Israel into the land and conquer it, so that they could settle there and fulfill the promise which had originally been made to Abraham. Joshua is an interesting figure because this is the name of Jesus. Jesus, who came into the world as the successor of Moses, the one who would replace the law of Moses in the life of Israel. Joshua was the physical successor of Moses, not the son of Moses. He wasn't connected with Moses in his family or anything like that, but he was chosen by God and anointed by Moses himself. Moses recognized this, that Joshua was the one who who would lead the people into their inheritance. Well, Joshua did that and conquered the land more or less. I mean, not completely, but enough so that the people were able to establish themselves, that they could settle there, and that they could begin to build what would become the state of Israel in later times. But at that time, they had no government. The tribes settled in different parts of the country, and they more or less lived by themselves. This was perhaps good in a way, because they were reasonably free to do what they wanted to do, but they were small and they were relatively defenseless. They conquered a country, but without fully realizing that there were enemies who would attack them when they got the opportunity to do so. Some of these enemies had been there for a long time, and they were closely related to Israel way back from the days of Abraham. You see, some of the children of Abraham who were not chosen, part of the chosen people, had survived in the land, and they became the ancestors of the different people who were living there, and who by now were enemies, or potential enemies at least, of Israel. But there was another group, the group that we call the Philistines, who had come from across the sea. We don't know exactly where they came from. One theory is that they might have come from Crete, the island of Crete. But whether that's true or not, they invaded the country from the sea and established a number of cities along the coast, cities which are still there. Gaza is perhaps the one best known to us, but there were others as well, which became their fortresses. And these people were very strong, they were very united, and they were quite different from the Israelites. They were completely different background and everything else. And they proved to be the strongest enemies of the people. They also, their importance can be seen from the fact that they left their name on the land. That the name Palestine, which we still use today, comes from them. You see, so they did leave their mark on the country, even though as a nation they have disappeared. But they remain, even today, you see, when we talk about the Palestinians, the Palestinian Arabs, who are the enemies of Israel and a danger to the state of Israel, at least as the Israelis today perceive this. You see, they still think in those terms. So these people were there, and Israel had to fight them, had to defend itself against them. But because they had no government of their own, because the tribes were divided, their resistance was not usually very successful. And so God had raised up a series of judges who attracted the allegiance, the loyalty of the different tribes who identified with Israel, and who from time to time were given the power, the authority to raise armies to fight to defend Israel against these enemies. Now, we read about these people, and they're quite extraordinary in some ways. I mean, there was the woman Deborah, for example, who she couldn't fight in the war herself, but she got a man around her, a man called Barak, who did the fighting for her. but Barak was subject to Deborah. I mean, she was the one who was in control, which was a very unusual thing, of course, in those days. Samson, the great Judge Samson, who was an extraordinary character, a very mighty man, but also a very weak person, someone who was easily swayed by women, and fell for deception very easily. And we hear his tragic story told to us. And there were many people like this, you see, over several generations. And what seemed to happen was that they would rule Israel for a few years, die, and there would be no obvious successor. And so Israel would fall apart. The nation would collapse again until another leader, another judge emerged who would put things back together and try to rule the country in some way or other. The last of these judges was a man called Samuel. And of course we read a lot about Samuel in the Old Testament. Samuel was an extraordinary person in his own right. He was born as a miracle, really. His mother was not able to have children, but she prayed for this, and God heard her prayer, and Samuel was born. His mother then dedicated him to God by taking him to the tabernacle, and he grew up around the priests and so on, so he knew about this. And when he came of age, when he became an older man, he became the judge of Israel. And he was a great judge and very widely accepted as such. But in his time, the underlying problem of the judges became too difficult to deal with. What was the problem? They had no successors. Samuel was married, he had children, he had sons who could have taken over from him. But the sons were not anything like their father. They didn't have the abilities of the father, and of course they weren't chosen by God in the way that Samuel had been. And so the people of Israel, they became worried. They said, well, who is going to rule Israel when Samuel dies? You see, what is going to happen? It's all right now, Samuel is in charge, but after he goes, are we going to go back to the problems that we had before? And the answer to that was, well, probably yes, because we don't know who the next ruler will be. And so the Israelite leaders, the leaders of the different tribes, got together and they went to Samuel and said, we need to have a king. Give us a king. All the other nations round about, they have kings. They don't have the problems that we have. They don't fall apart every time the king dies. They have a centralized government, they have an organized army, and so on. They can fight, and we are the victims. We are the ones who are going to suffer because we don't have the same resources that they have. Samuel, of course, was not happy with this because Samuel said, well, the king of Israel is God. I am a judge, yes, God has chosen me as a judge, but God is the real ruler. And God will provide a king, or God will provide judges for you as he has done in the past. So this is a form, you want to be like the other nations, but you are not like the other nations. You are a chosen people. You are different from them. And you must demonstrate this by the way you live. You see, wanting to be like them. You want a king the way other people have kings, but you are rejecting God in doing this. And Samuel prayed about this, and God told Samuel this very thing. He said, it's not you they're rejecting, Samuel. You're not the problem. They're rejecting me. And God realized this. But he said to Samuel, he said, never mind, give them a king. You see, that's what they want. Let them have it. Tell them what is going to happen. Because when they have a king, the king will organize a government, the king will introduce taxation, you'll have to pay him, you'll have to serve in his army. Life is going to be quite difficult in many ways, and if you think that the things are going to be much better once you have a king, you are fooling yourself. It's not going to be like that. You're going to have trouble that you're not aware of. So Samuel told the people this. He said, look, this is not necessarily the best answer. But the people insisted. They said, yes, we know that all this is going to happen, but we still want a king. So Samuel said, okay, I'll go and find you a king. And so Samuel went around the tribes of Israel looking for somebody who could be a good king for them. Now, of course, and this is it fits with the whole story, the whole history of Israel. What Samuel and the people wanted was a man that they could respect, a great man, a great warrior, someone who stood high in the life of the people, in the estimation of the people, someone they could look up to, someone who they could say, oh, that's our king, this great ruler here. And he found what he was looking for in a man called Saul, because Saul was tall, he was a big person, he was a gifted hunter and so on. He could, he looked the part. He looked like the sort of person who would make a really good king. And so Samuel chose him. Now the problem, as I'm sure you will have guessed by now, is that Samuel and the people were thinking in human terms. They were thinking as men think and not in the way that God thinks. So they chose somebody who, from the human point of view, they thought would be a great success. And they made him king. And for a while, things went well. Saul organized things. He organized the army. He beat the Philistines to some degree. He rescued the nation. He gave them a sense of their own power, their own security, and so on. He was apparently quite a good king at the beginning. But then it turned out that Saul was not really totally in tune with the will of God. You see, God told Saul that the only way he could secure Israel, the only way that Israel could really survive, was by eliminating its enemies. They had to be destroyed. Otherwise, they would spring up again and they would attack, and when Israel was weak, they would conquer. And one of these nations that was a particular problem was the nation of the Amalekites. Now, the Amalekites had been around for a long time. They'd been around longer than the Philistines. And they had been a problem in the past. They had attacked Abraham a very long time before. And God said, it's time to get rid of the Amalekites. You see, they are a danger. He told Saul, you need to go and eliminate them. So Saul did. He went and he defeated the Amalekites, and he killed most of them, so that they were exterminated in a way. But he didn't kill their king, whom he took back as a trophy, as a victory of war. And he didn't get rid of their animals or their possessions, because he said, well, this is good. We'll take the sheep and the cattle and the camels and so on. We'll take all this for ourselves. We'll take all the wealth of the Amalekites and just claim this as part of our victory. But that's not what God had said. God had said, destroy everything. When Saul didn't do that, God told Samuel, who was still alive, he said, go and tell Saul that Saul has disobeyed me. See, Saul is not doing what I told him to do. And Samuel went to Saul and explained this. He said, look, you have disobeyed God. And Saul said, well, what's so bad about that? Isn't it better to keep these things? Why should we destroy everything? And Samuel said, because God said you should destroy everything. That's what you should do. And you have disobeyed God. Well, Saul didn't really understand this. You see, he thought in human terms, make myself rich, keep the riches of the Amalekites, and whatever God said, we know better. We're going to do this. It's better for us. And so for that reason, and from then on, Saul was rejected. God said, this is no good. We've got to get rid of Saul. But instead of abolishing the monarchy, God didn't say, well, go back to the judges the way we were before. He told Samuel, he said, go and find somebody else to be the king. And so Samuel went out and looked around to see who he could find. And this time he came across somebody who was not the biggest and best and most wonderful person that you could imagine. He found David. And David was the youngest son of a man called Jesse who lived in Bethlehem. Now, Jesse was a good man. He was a fairly rich man and so on, and he had a number of sons who were distinguished in their own way. They were quite reasonable people. Maybe not as wonderful as Saul, but still, they would have made good kings, apparently. But God said to Samuel, no, I don't want them. I want a son of Jesse, but not these. And so Jesse showed Samuel all his sons, and we got to the end, and Samuel said, no, don't want any of these. Are you sure you haven't got another son? And Jesse said, well, I do have one more son, but he's very young and he's inexperienced and he's out looking after the sheep and so on. Samuel said, bring him, let me see him. And so David came, and although he was the youngest and in some ways least impressive of the children of Jesse, Samuel said, this is the man I am choosing. This is the right one. And so from then on, David becomes the chosen one. He is the one who is going to become the successor of Saul. Well, a series of events followed. Saul started having problems. He had psychological problems and suffered from mental illness from time to time. David, it turns out, was a musician. He played the harp, and he was invited to play for Saul because he was able, by his music, to soothe Saul. Saul would sort of sleep well after hearing this, and it seemed to be some kind of, not exactly cure. He wasn't curing his mental problems, but at least making them less serious. And so Saul recognized this, and and added David to his court. And David, as we know, became very good friends with Saul's son Jonathan, who ought to have been Saul's successor on the throne. And the Bible tells us all of this in very great detail. And basically the story is that David went from strength to strength. David was the one who defeated Goliath, the giant of the Philistines, even though nobody believed he could do that. And he triumphed over this. David became very popular with the people because he was clearly a warrior. He was somebody who could really win battles and so on. They saw this, and Saul became very jealous. Saul began to see that his kingdom would be taken away from him one way or another, and he began to attack David. And we find that Jonathan, Saul's son, was a friend of David and was sort of caught in the middle, really, between these. On the one hand, he was David's friend and wanted to protect David, but on the other hand, he was also the son of the king and owed allegiance to the king. And of course, Saul realized, and he said to Jonathan, do you know that this David is going to steal your crown? You will never be king, but David will take your place. Jonathan may have understood that, but it didn't bother him because the friendship with David was too great. Anyhow, we hear many chapters of this. You see how this struggle went on in the last years of Saul, until a time came when both Saul and Jonathan died together in battle against the Philistines. They lost the battle. And because they were both killed, David was the one to whom the people turned, and they made him the king. Now, when David became king, God renewed his covenant with Israel. He didn't do that with Saul, but with David he did. And he said to David, you will reign, your family will reign over Israel forever. There will never come a time when your family will not reign. Well, this was a big promise to make. David had a large family. He had many wives, and the family was a difficult problem because the brothers fought each other. The brothers were rivals for the throne. David himself committed a very terrible sin because he wanted the wife of one of his generals as his wife, and he arranged for the general to be killed, and then he married Bathsheba, this woman. And of course God realized what David was doing and condemned this, and when they had a child, the child died because God said, I must punish this. We cannot allow this to happen. But when all that was finished and David repented and confessed his sin, this woman, Bathsheba, had another son, and this son, Solomon, was to be David's successor. And it was in this very unlikely child that the promise made to David was fulfilled. David captured the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem had not been conquered by Joshua. It was one of the places that had resisted. But David conquered it, and he moved his capital there. David built himself a palace, and he wanted to build a house for the Lord, for God, to put the worship, make the worship of Israel centered in this temple. But God said, no, you have been a man of war. You've shed blood. You are not the one to build my temple. It will be your son. And so it was Solomon who built the temple. And this temple was to become the focus of Israel's worship. It was here in the temple that the covenant with Moses, the priestly covenant, came to its definitive definition, the definitive system. It was closely tied to the kingship, to the monarchy. This was the golden age of Israel. The kings who succeeded in the subsequent generations, some of them were good, most of them were bad. The history of Israel's kings is not particularly edifying for us, not a good story. And after several hundred years, about 400 years, the kingdom was destroyed, and it was never put back. But the family of David survived. And, of course, Jesus was born into that family. He was the son of David. And he was the one who inherited the promise made to David that one of his descendants would rule over Israel forever. There would no longer be earthly kings, physical descendants of David ruling in Jerusalem. But there would be the heavenly king, Christ, who would not rule in Jerusalem on earth, but who would rule in the heavenly Jerusalem, the city of God in heaven. And it is ironic, but nevertheless very telling, that it was when Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem, or just outside Jerusalem, it was very ironic that the king, sorry, I must start again. It was very ironic that the kingdom, as established by David, disappeared, but when Jesus was crucified on the Mount of Olives just outside Jerusalem, that the Roman governor of the time, Pontius Pilate, wrote an inscription on it, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," and a crown of thorns was placed on his head. This was the nature of the kingdom that was inherited. This is what God had called Jesus to proclaim, that his kingdom was not of this world. His kingdom was a new reality, something that had never previously been known or seen in Israel, but which came into existence for the first time in this way. And this is what we have now inherited as Christians, that Jesus is our King. He is the Son of David, who rules from his heavenly throne. And in that respect, the covenant made with Israel, made with David rather, has been fulfilled forever.